dumps are an integral part of the sheep system on Brent's place, and on talking to him in the lead up to this discussion, all of Brent's issues were about nutrition. And so leading into our second discussion, it's about filling the feed gap, and over to you, Brent, to talk about what you're doing with sowing crops for grazing purposes.
I'll throw it over to Alan, but yeah, he's just challenged us with a few things here, I guess, the stocking rate, the time of lambing, and like I said, that feed base and stocking rate are virtually the same thing. We could run more sheep, but then we won't be growing as much wheat the next year, I guess, because yeah, just the quality of the pasture. Yeah, so if you'd like to, I'd like to click it over to you, Alan.
Thanks, Brent. So, because Brent and Les are very keen to keep running sheep in their business, and I'm keen to see that they perhaps run their sheep and perhaps a little harder at high stocking rates. And to do that, you need more feed. But you don't necessarily need more feed in spring. You need more feed earlier and more feed in the summer and the autumn. So to answer that question about new pasture options of how we might get more feed on both heavy and light land and even saline land, we did a bit of a pasture demonstration in 2018, and so I don't think a surprise to anybody, but the rain really didn't get much rain until the end of May, and the first decent rain I think was around about June the 8th. So Les and Brent sowed some trials, and just interesting, the trials the results we got when we measured at the end of July. Dictator forage barley, pretty impressive. Vortex annual ryegrass, pretty impressive. And Racina Vetch, which was in a next door paddock to this heavy land trial site, which was unsprayed, was pretty impressive as well. And even the Vetch that was sprayed and unsprayed, sprayed both the Racina and the Volga, which was in the trial, they were quite impressive as well relative to everything else. So yeah, if you want an early feed, then barley and or ryegrass and or vetch are probably the way to go. And you'll see in that trial we also had a number of pasture legumes, but even by July the 28th, there was almost nothing to measure. There was so little, so I didn't bother measuring it. So on heavy land, that seems to be the obvious way to go. If we go to the next slide. We had a look at light land, where perhaps vetch is not as suitable, but Stuart might tell us something about rhizobia, more perhaps acid tolerant. No surprise there that the annual ryegrass was the best performer. Not bad were the Cerridellas, and all the clovers were so much low production that it was not worth measuring at that same stage in July. So yeah, as we all know, ryegrass does very well early and get plenty of early feed. We also looked at saline land, and that wasn't sown until the 15th of June because we wanted a decent rain to leach a bit of salt out of the topsoil. And these are the results we got when we measured it on the 24th of September, about 100 days later. Once again, no surprise that the forage barley did pretty well. The Vortex ryegrass did well. Neptune Messina did well, despite the fact that we didn't have the rainfall that perhaps is expected for or required for Messina, and Scimitar Burmetic did pretty well. Nitro Persian, not much, and the Lucens didn't do much. So that gave us a bit of a guide to what were useful plants for heavy land, light land, and saline land on Les and Brent's farm. We'll just go to the next slide. Had a look at all the other options, just in case anybody's interested in a few of those different varieties. On the heavy land, that all the pasture legumes got sprayed and got hammered a little bit. I think it was Echo Par and Aim On, as I remember, Brent. And
Yep,
it sort of knocked them, yeah, that knocked them around a bit, but they did recover. Yeah, again, the vetches were impressive, and yeah, the SU, salt and SU barometric, which means was also performed well. So for some reason, the Vortex ryegrass didn't perform particularly well, nor did the scimitar barometric, nor did the Mawson subclover. So we just go to the light land, next one. Surprisingly, Mawson subclover did quite well, and as did the Margarita Ceradella and the Nungaran and Dalkeith and the Prima. So again, I guess pretty much as you might expect, although you might have thought the ryegrass would do a bit better. So yeah, interesting that the subclovers performed quite well, as did the Margarita Ceradella, which is probably what we would have all expected. Okay, if we just go to... So yeah, our conclusions were that if you wanted early feed, sow barley and common vetch. I'm not likely to sow ryegrass yet. On heavy land, a medic, maybe salt and SU barometric. On the light land, subclover with Ceradella, probably Margarita, but maybe Frano in the near future. Possibly Tammin might be another option as a subclover. On the heavy land, Messina and Scimitar medic. Maybe Lucerne, we've got a bit of a question there. And I guess future production, sheep production system, we're thinking that, or I'm thinking that maybe it's possible to do at least 100% regularly in a weaning rate, and then within the next 10 years, 120% weaning rate. Change lambing time to July, because labour's difficult to acquire. Maybe weaning those July-born lambs onto a standing fodder crop of vetch and maybe low lignin oats, or maybe lupins with vetch, to reduce the labour costs associated with feeding sheep. So yeah, they were, I guess, the results. And I guess, Brent, you might say how you responded to those results from those trials.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, well, obviously the barley was the best early feed. So now we've moved, a portion of our farm has been continuous crop, and the other, like, it's usually the same paddocks. The rest, the pastures are a rotation of sort of 2 in pasture, 1 in crop. It used to be wheat, then pasture. We've now changed that to barley, so that the year after we harvest the crop, we do get that early feed with volunteer barley. And yeah, then it's easy enough to tidy up later in the season. We started growing vetch. That was the most impressive thing in the whole, most impressive plant in the whole trial. Most farmers were very impressed with it, and it's the one I've been asked about the most by the guys who came out. We've also we've kept growing Messina on the salt scalds, along with the loose and the SARDI grazer. That was quite impressive on the salt land. And one for Pete and Omers, after we talked to Stuart, is, which I talked to Peter about, is the potential for a ryegrass fallow with the use of sheep into the future, just because of the amount more feed that is produced when we do that. There is a photo of some Racina vetch on the right-hand side of the screen. This photo was taken on the 11th of June. At the time, we had 87 mils of rain for the year. And I'm pretty well, this wouldn't have germinated off the subsoil moisture though. It would have, we had about 13 mil would have been the break on the 25th of May. And that's actually sown onto a canola stubble. Yeah, it was very impressive. It would have about double the biomass of any lupin, or probably a third as much again as any canola crop at the moment, which they probably would have germinated at about this. Well, they would have germinated at the same time. So yeah, it's just very impressive how much the vetch can keep growing when it gets cold and our other legumes stop growing.
Brent, key question from me to you though.
Yep.
If we're going to grow all this extra feed, what do you reckon we need to do to make money out of it, or more money? How might we consider changing what we do if there is a change to be done?
Growing our barley on pastures, I guess any waste from the header that gets thrown out the back, the sheep get to graze. It tends to grow more early feed, so that's making us more feed with our sheep, you'd have to say. That'd be one point. The vetch, that is the best feed. It's the crude protein levels are just higher than anything else, so the sheep are going to do very well off it. I suspect in a late break it will be the best performer of all the pastures, because it just keeps growing when it's cold. So if nothing germinates till mid-June, that's the only thing that will perform well. We're not at present. Alan's suggesting to wean onto the vetch crops, but we're just trying to bulk it up at the moment. It's very challenging to harvest. So we'll probably experiment with that a lot more into the future, but it's phenomenal, really. It's I think Floyd Sullivan at the trial was the amount of nitrogen he was saying we were producing per hectare was 120 kilos. So yeah, there's money to be made with that, I guess, through sheep feed and nitrogen for next year's crop.
Yeah, Tim, can I ask a question, Brent, about the do you sow any of your pastures earlier, and how do you manage that with grazing your sheep? Do you have your rotations right where you're not actually having to juggle sheep numbers and summer sowing, perhaps, if you do summer sowing, and sup feeding and all the rest of it? How do you manage that side of it to managing with your cropping rotations as well?
Yeah, okay. When we do sow pastures, usually it's the clover it'll be our first thing we sow before our canola around March, April, and it will be usually on a stubble that's been grazed out completely, and so there's no feed value left there. And I guess we have to lock that paddock up until it's established enough to graze. The sheep just have to spend time in another paddock. Yeah, when we sow the barley, I guess most people do the old until you can rip a leaf off the barley, you can't put sheep that's not ready to graze.
So Racina's doing well for you, and we know that vetches are gaining some attention in WA, the southern part of WA, over the last few years, and there's lots of other options apart from Racina. I'd like Stuart, if you wouldn't mind, to tell us what other opportunities might exist, Stuart, with this pasture species.
Certainly, certainly. As everyone said, I'm Stuart Nagel. I'm the national vetch breeder, but based out of South Australia. But we're working across the country. One of the things that you really need to consider with vetch, and when you're talking about vetch, is there are 3 major vetch species grown in Australia, and to varying levels. There's purple vetch, which is Poppany, and I think Barloo is grown in Western Australia. There is woolly pod vetches, which are the Capello, Haymaker, RM4, and in the old days, Namoi. And there are the common vetches, which are what Brent's growing with the Racina, Morava, Volga, Timok, and they're the predominant species. But what you need to remember is that they are 3 different management techniques for those, and they are quite different fits in your system. With the woolly pods in particular, the RM4 and the Capello and Haymaker, you have to remember the older varieties, in particular Namoi and Haymaker, have very high hard seeded levels. They are a genuine dormant seed, which you will have in your system for decades. In reality, it's not something that you need to forget about. And the grain of that species is also not to be fed to ruminants. So it is purely a grazing or a fodder plant. It produces very high levels of fodder, but once again, it's a longer system. The system Brent's talking about is looking for that July-August feed. The Haymaker and Capello, unless you can sow them really early and get into warm soil with moisture, you won't be getting their bulk production through until the end of September, even middle of October at best. They don't like the winter cold a great deal. They will come up, emerge, and just sit through July, August, and then once it warms up, they come on. But in a decent rainfall environment, and I'm talking 450 plus mil rainfall, they will produce probably 1.5 tons at minimum more fodder at the end of the year than the common vetches. And the guys down, I think Tim's actually growing some RM4 down around Esperance and Cascade. There's a lot of people putting them in as the first thing they sow and grazing it relatively early, because they go in with any moisture in say late March, early April. Graze it early, graze it again in late winter, and lock it up if you like. One point I will make of what Brent raised before about blowing out a crop when he had a frosted crop. That's one of the advantages you can get if you're grazing the legumes or even cutting for hay, that you can stop moisture loss around September, the end of September, when you're cutting or grazing it out, and you are storing some over the summer in ideal conditions. It's not always going to work, but it is one option. So that's the woolly pods. Not a lot of Barloo or Poppany are grown in the west. Some people are. It's an even later option than the woolly pods. Its strength is you can use broad strike in crop with the purple vetches. And so you've got an option for other things. You can't use broad strike in crop for any other vetches but the purples. And its other selling point, apart from being very, very late, is it takes waterlogging better than any of the vetches. And so over in the eastern states, a lot of that is grown in our southeast of South Australia and southern Victoria, where they get ridiculously long, wet winters on heavy black soils. It puts up with that waterlogging, and it's not being cut for hay until early November. So that's that option. With the commons, which Brent is using, they've got the better early vigor. They have better early growth through winter, although it's not, I don't think it's stunning. It is better than medics and things like that. They have a more versatile chemical range in your post-sowing pre-emergent herbicides. And so they're a bit more adaptable. They take grazing okay. The one thing that's often forgotten about the common vetches like Racina is you can feed the grain to ruminants like you can a lupin. It's a very high protein grain. You need a lot of forage, roughage with it. But in the situations where you've got a silo full and you're desperate for feed, you've got that option. Unfortunately, in Western Australia, grain prices are so high, you're probably not going to see the value for money. But if you're in a drought situation, the common vetch grain can be utilised as a high value fodder. You're talking 30% protein and up to 15 megajoules of energy. It's a very good, very rich source. We did some trials years ago feeding it, Maraba specifically, but same as Racina, and very, very high growth rates on that as either pure vetch with ad lib hay or mixtures of different cereals. So that's a consideration. With what Brent's doing, Racina's not a bad option there. I'm surprised it was doing better than Volga. There are other options around timing. I'm not sure how you're looking time-wise when you're sowing the vetch, Brent. When about were you sowing?
Must have been the 15th of April.
Oh, okay. That's, yeah. And a lot of people do throw, particularly the common vetches, as the first thing they sow. It goes.
It was a late break, that one. That was just for the trial.
Yeah.
But this year, Anzac Day, and we sow canola first, or pastures canola, then vetch before the lupins. So I don't know what you think about that, Stuart.
Yeah, if you're aiming for the early feed, the earlier you can get it in, the better. A lot of people in our mallee, in the sandy country in our mallee, will put it in on, if they get a 20 mil event in March, they'll put vetch in because it has that. The commons in particular have the capacity to come up and sit waiting for more moisture. They'll sit around. You will eventually curtail your yield potential, but they have that ability to sit for a long time on moisture. One thing Tim raised about creating value in your enterprise. In the last few years, I've spent a fair bit of time in Western Australia just driving around. And I was surprised at the lack of haymaking by farmers. And that is an option if you're looking for weed control and sort of paddock management. Hay production can be a really good source of income, and vetch hay is a very, very high value fodder. And the other advantage is you're baling up a lot of your weeds. So you're either controlling where they're fed or you're selling them to your next door neighbour. So you're getting a value option off that crop as an aside. That's a bit of an aside.
If I can just interrupt, Stuart, look, there is potential to do that. I mean, you look at if you read the Weekly Times from Victoria, as I do, it's interesting to see the value that dairy farmers put on vetch hay. Yeah. So much so that they even advertise the energy and protein content of that vetch hay.
Yeah.
I guess I wouldn't see a great demand for vetch hay in our wheat belt because we've got a lot of alternatives to feed sheep. But I think there is a real opportunity to supply vetch hay to our relatively small dairy industry. But that's where I'd see where there could be a good market for vetch hay.
And the hay processors in Victoria focus on vetch into the dairies in the Goulburn Valley, and I realise you have a relatively small industry there, but there is a potential there for value adding outside of just putting it through a sheep first and foremost, or storing it for summer, because you're always going to have that summer feed deficit, if you like. Putting it in a bale and putting it in a shed will get you through that time.
Can you bale it by itself, Stuart, or do you have to mix it with like oats? Say grow oats, vetch, and it'd be pretty hard to bale, I'd imagine. Is it?
It's not too bad by itself, but drying time is the issue.
Okay.
If you've got it mixed with a oat or a barley, even a canola, the windrows stay open better and you get better dry down. Vetch by itself, when it's cut, you will have seen it. It does collapse into quite a compact windrow, so it does take a lot longer to dry. But it is certainly not that hard to do. You raised issues around harvesting of vetch for seed. We traditionally use crop lifters, with flex fronts and all that. I'm not sure how you go fitting them all.
Yeah.
We use, in the breeding program, we use what was built over here, a Heaslip P lifter, which was a knuckled articulated lifter which runs along the ground. Primary sales, I know, do some quite good long lifters that they stick on.
They have a lentil lifter I've heard of, which some vetch experts over here have said is pretty good. Yeah, yep.
There's a lentil one, and I think they have a big wide one they recommend using for beans as well. And
Okay.
Once you're under the crop with vetch, you'll pick it up. That's the trouble. If it gets a bit thin, you're not going to pick up much. But that's like
What about the seedbed preparation, Stuart? Just treat it like peas? Would you roll it, or do you have anything you recommend there?
Preferably, you would roll. A lot of people like to leave their their press wheel burrows there, and that can offer protection. Particularly, you guys have had big winds and stuff, so you do get a bit of burning if you haven't got that protection. But like a pea, it does benefit from rolling, and it does push down anything that's going to come through your header, because you are having to harvest pretty close to the ground. And in certain years, it's a pain, but often harvesting in one direction can help as well, because in most of South Australia, we have prevailing southwesterlies, and the crop always lays away from that. If you're harvesting into that, it just feeds up. You can either go into or across, but if you're harvesting with it, it's like running your fingers through your hair. You leave most of it behind. So there are issues around that harvesting. Unfortunately, it grows as a really long trailing plant, so we can't make it stand up like a Casper pea. We don't have that option. So that is a consideration. But if you've harvested peas and lentils, you'll harvest vetch okay. Another thing Alan brought up, I think, was about the rhizobia, and there are new strains coming out of South Australia and Western Australia of acid tolerant rhizobia, which will make a huge difference. I'm not sure if they're on the market as of next year. I think the one in South Australia was meant to be, but they have better persistence in the soil. Over here in neutral to alkaline soils, if you've grown vetch in the last 4 years, there is no need to inoculate. We have that like free living rhizobia. In the acid soils and the sand, the lighter sands, that persistence is just not there. And hopefully the new rhizobia we're seeing is more persistent, as well as tolerant to that lower pH. And we're talking 5.5, I think they're aiming that sort of thing at pH. That could really help. But
that's where we're running into issues. If it gets expensive to dry seed, having to use a Losca inoculant, I guess.
Yeah.
But then, as I was talking to you a couple of weeks back about volunteers coming up, you're saying if it was peas, I guess we'd think that it comes back about. If it was peas, I'd get more rhizobia. You're saying that it should, which is quite interesting, because we had a bit of a dig, and there was actually some nods starting to form on a volunteer that was from 3 seasons ago. So they hadn't started nodule. Well, there was nods there, but they weren't pink. So have to get back and have a look, I guess. It sounds like we might be impressed.
Vetch is quite promiscuous when it comes to the rhizobia it requires. It is recommended to be, or I think if you're talking to Floyd, he'll tell you E or F, but it is quite promiscuous. we have a site here in South Australia. It's heavier soil in the upper mid-north, where the pH was down around 5. The farmer had limed it up to 5.5, and he did not have a legume on that paddock for 7 years that he knew of. And he couldn't remember one, but it was definitely 7 years without a legume. And we did a test on it because I wanted to try these new rhizobia out, and the vetch just nodulated like crazy. It was picking up some free-living rhizobia in that really, really acid soil for us. And so I actually couldn't run my low pH rhizobia trial there because there was so much background. That it wasn't a sandy soil, and you guys, your alkalinity, salinity and acid profile is a bit different to ours. But the new rhizobia will make an option, a really good option, I think, in time. Going back to what Floyd was saying about the nitrogen you're fixing, we work on a rough figure of about 20 kilograms per hectare. 20 kilograms per hectare per tonne of dry matter produced. And so that's where he would have been getting that 120 kilograms sort of thing. If you turn that in as green manure, you'll get more, but most people won't do that. Another interesting option for a system like yours, Brent, coming, there's a variety that will be out next year called Studenitsa, and that has superior winter and cold, in particular, growth to the other common vetches, much superior. It was designed to go into our really marginal mixed cropping systems where they were looking for, they have a lot of trouble with that early winter autumn feed gap, early winter spring. And it's the earliest variety we've released, but its winter growth, particularly when you get a lot of frosts in July, August, this variety doesn't slow down and doesn't stop. Comparing it to Racina, sowing very similar time to you, around that Anzac Day to the 5th of May, we were cutting this variety in our Mallee and upper north in the first week of August, and it was producing a minimum of 750 kilograms per hectare more dry matter at that point than Racina. And so, and this was in the presence of one of those sites was at Bullaroo, where they'd had in June, July, they'd had 28 days below -1, I think, mornings. And so that really, really cold environment shuts down most vetches. This one keeps going, and it produces that bulk earlier. Racina and Morava in particular will run later, but if you're looking for July, August, and early September fodder and production, this variety will do really, really well, and it'll completely destroy Racina eventually for that lower rainfall environment. When you're talking, if you're looking for later and hay production, Morava is the latest of the common vetches. It's the oldest of the varieties we have, but it's the latest one. And Racina flowers in around 100 to 105 days. Morava flowers at about 115 days, and you've got this much later production. It doesn't grow through winter anywhere near as well as these two I've just talked about, but it produces higher end yields in late September. So if you're looking for a hay production, Morava is an option. The other thing about the commons, and I've made a point about the woolly pods with hard seeded, the commons are considered to be soft seeded, and the seeds that don't germinate each year are generally not dormant. I know Brent said to me a couple of weeks ago that he had Racina coming back after 2 years. It should be controllable in a barley crop. If you're knocking out any other broadleafs, that should be killed at the same time. It will depend on your end use and what chemicals you're using. Yeah, I'm loath to recommend much in that way.
Well, it's got through a bit of low ground, yeah.
Oh, did it?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'm surprised at that, but yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it is it is good to spray for radish. Is that Studenitsa going to be similar, is it, Stuart?
It's going to be the same chemical profile for those guys.
Yep.
You have very little options. Tim and I were talking last week about trying to get radish out of RM4 and Capello at the moment, and the only thing registered in the country is Ecopar, and you've seen the damage Ecopar can do. It'll set you back. If you're going for grain production, Ecopar's not so bad, because the plant has time to recover. It will, if you get the rates right, it will result in some plant death. It will result in bleaching and really setting back for a 3 to 4 week period. But if you're after grain production and you don't want the radish seed in your grain, that's your best option. If you're going for fodder production, you need not do it, because it will really do some damage. That's the only thing registered. When Tim and I were talking, we were both actually looking at the Hart Field Day website with their herbicide tolerance trials, and that's a great resource about what things kill vetch and what don't, and tricks you can use, but none of them are registered, so I can't speak about them in public.
Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, those sort of options. And as I said, with Capello and Haymaker, you need to consider that you never want to take that through to grain if you're grazing it. The Studenitzes, the Racina and Morava are a great grain product for sheep, but the price that you're paying for the grain, you will not put it through a sheep at the moment, I wouldn't have thought. One thing I will say, Peter Newman last week did bring up why vetches suddenly come into the system, if you like. And one thing I will say about it, looking at the other options Brent and Alan were trying, is in a cropping system where you're 100% cropping or even 70%, vetch gives you that 1 year option. The Cerridellas, the medics, and these things need to be managed over time. You won't get the best out of a medic or a Cerridella in 6 months, whereas vetch can be put in and out with a targeted option, a targeted endpoint of what you're trying to achieve. And that's where that versatility in the cropping systems come from, and why it's sort of catching on in the south.